If you'd asked me a year ago, I would have sworn Dina and I had the kind of marriage people envied. We were that couple, always laughing, finishing each other's sentences, and sneaking moments of affection even after years together. When we decided it was time to have a child, it felt like everything was lining up perfectly. The idea of becoming parents wasn't scary to us, it felt exciting, like the start of a new chapter we'd been building toward for years. At first, the decision seemed to bring us closer. We'd lie awake at night, talking about baby names and wondering who the kid would take after. Dina said she hoped they'd have my calm nature, and I joked that I hoped they'd get her looks, just not her temper. It felt good, imagining our future like that, like everything we worked for was coming together. But as the months went on, things shifted. Slowly at first, so subtle that I didn't think much of it. Dina wasn't as affectionate as she used to be. She'd pull away from my kisses, claim she was tired, or say she wasn't feeling well. At first, I chalked it up to the stress of trying to conceive. I figured she was just overwhelmed by the pressure of timing everything right or worried about what came next. I decided to make things easier for her. I started planning little surprises to cheer her up. Booking a fancy dinner downtown, arranging a weekend getaway to the mountains, even splurging on a bracelet I knew she'd been eyeing for months. When I gave it to her, she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I convinced myself she was just stressed, maybe even a little hormonal. Still, the distance grew. It wasn't just the physical space between us, it was something deeper, something I couldn't put into words. She stopped asking about my day and started spending more time scrolling on her phone. We'd sit on opposite ends of the couch at night, and it felt like I was a stranger in my own home. Work didn't help. I'd never loved my office job, it was just something I did because it paid the bills. But I couldn't see myself quitting, especially now that we were talking about starting a family. The idea of giving up my steady paycheck for something uncertain felt irresponsible. So I kept my head down, clocked in, and came home feeling like a shell of myself, hoping Dina would be the anchor that kept me grounded. But she wasn't. She was slipping further away. I asked her one night if she was okay, and she laughed it off, saying I worried too much. "I'm fine, Phil. Everything's fine," she said. I wanted to believe her, but there was something in the way she said it, quick and dismissive, like she was shutting down the conversation before it could start. Looking back, there were signs, small things that should have made me question more. Like the way she started guarding her phone, taking it with her even to the bathroom. Or how she'd suddenly get defensive when I asked why she wasn't coming to bed anymore. At the time, I ignored them, telling myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I think I already knew. There was a heaviness in the air, like a storm building just over the horizon. I wasn't ready to face it yet, but I could feel it coming. Something was wrong, and no amount of trips, gifts, or wishful thinking was going to fix it. The day it all started unraveling wasn't some big dramatic event. Just one of those ordinary moments that, in hindsight, changes everything. It was a Thursday, a long and uneventful day at the office, the kind where I spent more time staring at the clock than doing actual work. When I got home, the house was unusually quiet. Dina wasn't in the living room like she normally was, flipping through channels or scrolling on her phone. I called out her name, and she answered from upstairs. She said she was folding laundry, which struck me as odd because that wasn't her usual chore. I was the one who always handled it. Still, I didn't think much of it. I dropped my bag and went to grab a drink from the fridge. As I passed the dining table, I noticed her phone sitting there. Dina never left her phone out. Ever. For the past few months, it had been glued to her hand or tucked safely away in her bag. I knew she had a passcode, but even the sight of it sitting there, unguarded, made me uneasy. I almost reached for it. Almost. But I stopped myself, shaking off the thought. I didn't want to be that husband, the one who snoops because he can't trust his wife. Still, the curiosity gnawed at me. What was she hiding? And why did it feel like her phone being out in the open was a slip-up, not just an accident? That night at dinner, she barely spoke. I asked her how her day was, and she gave me a vague answer about work being busy. I told her about a funny story from the office. Something about a coworker spilling coffee on his tie right before a big presentation, but she just nodded absent-mindedly, her eyes darting toward the kitchen as if she was looking for an escape. It wasn't like her. Dina used to be the one who kept our conversations alive, asking questions and teasing me until I cracked a smile. Now, it was like she was somewhere else entirely. After dinner, I suggested we watch one of her favorite shows, a guilty pleasure drama she never missed. She agreed, but halfway through the episode, she got up and said she was tired. She kissed my forehead, told me good night, and disappeared upstairs. I sat there for a while, staring at the screen but not really watching. The show played on, but my mind was stuck on her absence. The next morning, as I got ready for work, I noticed something else. Dina was standing by the window, phone in hand, smiling faintly at something on the screen. It wasn't the smile she used to give me, the warm, genuine kind that reached her eyes. This one was softer, almost secretive. I asked her what was so funny, and she turned to me, startled, like she hadn't realized I was there. "Oh, nothing," she said quickly, tucking her phone into her back pocket. That weekend, I tried again to bridge the growing gap between us. I suggested a day trip to the lake, something we used to love doing before life got so busy. She hesitated but eventually agreed. I packed us a picnic, loaded up the car, and even brought along her favorite blanket for lounging by the water. But the trip felt forced. She spent most of the time on her phone, replying to texts or scrolling aimlessly, barely acknowledging the scenery or the effort I'd put into planning everything. I tried to engage her, pointing out how clear the water looked or asking if she wanted to rent a kayak, but her answers were short, distracted. By the time we got home, I felt more exhausted than relaxed. I unloaded the car while she went inside without a word, and for the first time in our marriage, I felt completely alone even though she was just a few feet away. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. It was like we were living parallel lives, sharing the same space but moving in entirely different directions. And no matter how hard I tried to bring us back together, she kept drifting further away. The turning point came a few weeks later, though at the time, I didn't recognize it for what it was. I'd been trying to ignore the unease building inside me, brushing off the little things that didn't quite add up. But there's only so much you can dismiss before the cracks become too big to ignore. It started with a text. I was home early that day, which wasn't typical for me. My boss had cut the team loose after a grueling week, and I figured I'd surprise Dina by picking up her favorite takeout on the way home. I walked in with the food and called out to her, but she didn't answer. I found her upstairs in the bedroom, sitting cross-legged on the bed with her phone in her lap. When I stepped into the room, she jumped like I'd startled her, quickly locking her screen and setting the phone face down on the nightstand. Her reaction was so out of character that I froze for a second, takeout bag still in my hands. I asked if she was okay, and she nodded, saying she hadn't heard me come in. I wanted to believe her, but there was something in the way she avoided my eyes that made my stomach knot. Later that night, while she was in the shower, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. I glanced over out of instinct and saw the notification light up the screen. It was just a first name, Eva. Underneath, there was a preview of the message. Something short, casual looking. I tried to look away, but my eyes locked on the line. "I had fun last time. Let me know when you're free again." My chest tightened. It felt like the walls were closing in, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I told myself it had to be innocent. Maybe a friend from work or someone she'd met at a yoga class. But the words gnawed at me. Fun last time? Free again? When she came out of the bathroom, I tried to act normal, though I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. She climbed into bed and reached for her phone, casually unlocking it and scrolling like nothing had happened. I wanted to ask about the message, but the words stuck in my throat. The next day, I couldn't focus at work. My mind kept circling back to that text, replaying it over and over. I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. I really did. But something about it didn't sit right. That weekend, I decided to try again to reconnect. I planned a date night, something simple but meaningful. I made a reservation at the Italian place where we'd had our first anniversary dinner, thinking the nostalgia might bring back some of the warmth that had been missing. She agreed to go, but her enthusiasm felt forced. At dinner, she barely touched her food and kept checking her phone under the table. At one point, I asked her if something was wrong, and she waved it off, saying she was just tired. On the drive home, the silence was deafening. I reached over to hold her hand, but she pulled away, pretending to adjust her seatbelt. When we got back, she went straight upstairs, claiming she had a headache. I stayed downstairs for a long time, staring at the dark screen of the TV and nursing a drink. The house was quiet, but my mind wasn't. I couldn't stop replaying all the little moments that didn't make sense. The guarded phone, the half-hearted smiles, the evasive answers. I told myself I was overthinking it, letting my insecurities get the best of me. But deep down, I knew better. Something was happening, something she wasn't telling me. And for the first time, I started to wonder if I really wanted to know the truth. The day it all came crashing down started like any other. Another monotonous morning of dragging myself to the office, staring at spreadsheets, and counting down the hours until I could go home. My only real plan for the evening was to call the vet about our cat, Luna, who'd been limping the past few days. I'd meant to do it the night before, but work ran late, and by the time I got home, I was too drained to think about anything but collapsing on the couch. When I got home, Dina was in the kitchen, scrolling on her phone as usual. I asked her how her day was, and she shrugged, barely looking up. Her distant attitude wasn't surprising anymore. I'd come to expect it. As I went to grab my phone to make the call, I realized I'd left it in the car. Annoyed, I muttered about having to go back out, but then I saw Dina's phone sitting on the counter. It wasn't locked this time, just sitting there, unlocked, like an invitation. "Can I use your phone to call the clinic? Luna's vet?" I asked casually. Dina hesitated. It was only for a split second, but it was enough to catch my attention. She nodded, saying something about needing to check her messages but then handed it over reluctantly. Her hesitation made my pulse quicken. I dialed the clinic, trying to focus on the automated prompts while Dina busied herself with tidying up, her back to me. As I waited on hold, the phone vibrated in my hand, a text popping up on the screen. It was from someone named Eva, or at least that's how they were saved in her contacts. The message preview made my stomach drop. "When you come again, I'll punish you." Alongside it was a photo, a suggestive one of some kind of leather tool. I froze. My first instinct was denial. My brain scrambled for an innocent explanation, but nothing fit. The message wasn't ambiguous. It wasn't something you could misunderstand. I glanced at Dina, who was still cleaning but kept glancing at me out of the corner of her eye. It was like she knew. She must have known. "Dina," I said, keeping my voice steady, "can you come here for a second?" When she turned around and saw me holding her phone, the color drained from her face. She laughed nervously and asked what was up. I showed her the screen and asked her to explain. Her reaction was immediate, defensive, fumbling excuses about how the message was a joke or not what it looked like. She claimed Eva was a coworker who liked to mess around with inappropriate humor. I didn't buy it. "Then let's read the rest of the messages together," I suggested, handing her the phone. Her silence spoke louder than any explanation ever could. Her hand shook as she took the phone, clutching it like it might shield her from what was coming. She didn't open the messages, though. Instead, she clammed up, her eyes darting around the room like she was searching for an escape. In that moment, the weight of everything hit me. The late nights, the guarded phone, the distance, all of it clicked into place. Dina didn't need to say anything. Her guilt was written all over her face. I set her phone down on the counter and left the room without another word. My heart was racing, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. The truth had been staring me in the face for months, but seeing it spelled out in that text made it impossible to ignore. I locked myself in the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face, trying to calm the storm raging in my chest. My mind was spinning, torn between anger, heartbreak, and the undeniable realization that my marriage had been a lie. 4 months, I'd been fighting to save something that Dina had already destroyed. And now, there was no going back. The truth was out, and there was no way to put it back in the box. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the text over and over like a broken record. Dina didn't come upstairs. I heard her moving around downstairs for a while, but eventually, the house fell silent. Whether she'd gone to bed in the guest room or left altogether, I didn't know, and I didn't care enough to check. The next morning, the tension was suffocating. Dina was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, her phone nowhere in sight. When she saw me, she opened her mouth like she was going to say something, but nothing came out. I didn't bother breaking the silence. I grabbed a cup of coffee and sat across from her. The air between us felt like a physical wall, built brick by brick over months of her deceit and my denial. Finally, I spoke. I want the truth, Dina. No more excuses. No more lies.
Who is Eva?
She froze, gripping her coffee mug so tightly her knuckles turned white. Phil, it's not what you think. I swear. Don't, I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. Don't insult me by pretending there's some innocent explanation for that text. Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she might come clean. But then she shook her head, her eyes darting away from mine. It was just a mistake, she mumbled. A stupid one-time thing that didn't mean anything. A mistake? I repeated, my voice rising. Mistakes don't last for months, Dina. Mistakes don't send texts about punishments and whatever the hell that photo was. She flinched but didn't deny it. Instead, she launched into a string of half-baked excuses. How she'd been feeling neglected, how she didn't know how to tell me she was unhappy, how it just happened. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Neglected? I'd been bending over backward to make her happy for months, pouring every ounce of energy I had into trying to fix a marriage she'd already checked out of. I asked her how long it had been going on, and she hesitated before admitting it had started months ago, around the time she'd grown distant. She claimed it wasn't serious, that it had only happened a few times. And the text? I pressed. Her face turned red, and she stammered something about it being a joke between friends. The lie was so weak it was almost laughable. I saw your face when I read that message, I said, my voice cold and steady. You weren't joking. You were terrified because you knew the truth was out. Dina broke down then, burying her face in her hands and sobbing. She kept saying she was sorry over and over, but her apologies felt hollow. They weren't for me, they were for herself, for getting caught. I stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. I can't do this anymore, Dina, I said. I can't live in a marriage built on lies. She looked up, her face streaked with tears. Please, Phil. We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes. Just don't give up on us. But there was no us left to save. The woman sitting across from me wasn't the Dina I'd married. The woman I loved, the one I thought I'd spend my life with, had disappeared months ago, replaced by a stranger I didn't recognize. I told her I was leaving, and the look on her face was almost enough to make me hesitate. Almost. But then I remembered that text, the lies, the months of emotional distance, and the way she'd let me twist myself into knots trying to fix something she'd already destroyed. I packed a bag that afternoon and left without looking back. As I drove away, the house disappearing in my rearview mirror, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Grief for the life I thought we had, anger at her betrayal, and underneath it all, a small flicker of relief. For the first time in months, I felt like I could finally breathe. I didn't go far at first. Driving aimlessly felt pointless, so I ended up at my parents' house. It wasn't ideal, I hadn't stayed there in years, but it felt like the only place I could go without having to explain everything. When I walked through the door with my bag, my mom immediately knew something was wrong. She didn't ask questions, just gave me a hug and said, "Stay as long as you need." Dad gave me a pat on the back, a gruff, "You're welcome here, son," and went back to his crossword puzzle. That was all the acknowledgement I needed. The first few days were a blur. I called out of work, claiming I was sick, and spent most of the time in my old bedroom, staring at the walls or scrolling aimlessly on my phone. Dina texted me a few times, apologies, pleased to talk, promises that she'd do whatever it took to fix things. I ignored them all. I wasn't ready to talk, and honestly, I wasn't sure I ever would be. What was there to say? She'd betrayed me, lied to me, and shattered the life we'd spent years building together. No amount of words could undo that. Eventually, my mom cornered me in the kitchen. She didn't press for details, just said, "You can't let this destroy you, Phil. You've got to figure out what comes next." I nodded, but I didn't really know what next looked like. The thought of going back to that house, to my old life, felt impossible. But starting over from scratch? That felt equally daunting. After a week of wallowing, I knew I couldn't keep hiding out at my parents' place forever. I needed a plan, something to give me a sense of direction. I'd always loved tinkering with computers and had spent years teaching myself video editing as a hobby. It was something that had always calmed me, given me a sense of control when everything else felt chaotic. One night, I pulled out my laptop and started poking around online. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for, but somehow, I ended up on a freelance site. There were listings for editing gigs, small projects like cutting together birthday videos or splicing home movie footage. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. I decided to take a chance. With some savings I'd been holding onto, I bought parts to build a better computer. It was a splurge I probably shouldn't have made, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of excitement. While I waited for the parts to arrive, I started putting myself out there. Setting up profiles on freelancing platforms, uploading samples of work I'd done over the years for friends and family. I figured it was a long shot, but to my surprise, I got my first client within a few days. The job wasn't anything special, editing a promotional video for a small business, but it felt like a lifeline. For the first time since leaving Dina, I had something to focus on, something that made me feel like I could take control of my life again. I threw myself into the work, staying up late and fine-tuning every detail. When I sent the final product to the client and they replied with a glowing review, it was like a weight lifted off my chest. It wasn't just about the money or the work itself, it was about proving to myself that I could still build something, even after everything I'd lost. Over the next few weeks, I took on more projects, slowly building a portfolio and gaining regular clients. It wasn't easy, there were long nights, tight deadlines, and the constant pressure of trying to make ends meet. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was doing something that mattered. Through it all, I ignored Dina's messages. I blocked her number after the first few days, but she found other ways to reach out. Emails, mutual friends, even showing up at my parents' house once. I didn't answer the door. I wasn't ready to face her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The weeks turned into months, and slowly, life started to feel a little more stable. I wasn't thriving yet, but I was surviving, and that felt like a victory in itself. Staying with my parents was humbling, but it gave me the time and space I needed to get back on my feet. Most of my days were spent at the desk I'd set up in my old bedroom, hunched over my new computer as I worked on editing projects. It wasn't glamorous, but there was something therapeutic about losing myself in the details. Adjusting lighting, fine-tuning transitions, syncing audio. Every completed project felt like a small piece of myself being rebuilt. The work was steady, and the clients were happy. Slowly, I was starting to make enough money to think about getting a place of my own. It wasn't just about the money though. It was about feeling capable again. But the nights were hard. When the house got quiet, and I didn't have work to distract me, my mind wandered. I'd think about Dina, how she used to curl up next to me on the couch, how her laugh had once been the best sound in the world. And then I'd think about that text, her lies, the betrayal, and the ache in my chest would come back like it was brand new. I didn't want to admit how much I still missed her. Not after what she'd done. Missing her felt like a betrayal of myself, like I was clinging to a ghost of someone who didn't exist anymore. One night, my mom knocked on my door and handed me a cup of tea. She sat down on the edge of the bed and just looked at me for a long moment before saying, "You're doing better, Phil. I can see it. But you're not letting yourself heal. You've got to let go of the anger." I wanted to argue with her, to tell her that I had every right to be angry. But she was right. The anger was eating me alive. Every time I thought about Dina, it wasn't just the betrayal that hurt. It was the version of myself I'd lost in the process. I asked her how I was supposed to let go of that kind of pain. She didn't have an answer, just gave my hand a squeeze and told me it would come with time. The next day, I decided to make a change. I couldn't keep letting my nights be swallowed by regret and resentment. I signed up for a gym membership, something I'd been avoiding for years, and started going every evening. At first, it was awkward. I was out of shape, and everything hurt. But I kept going. It wasn't just about getting fit. It was about proving to myself that I could still take care of something, even if it was just my own body. The gym became my sanctuary. When I was lifting weights or running on the treadmill, I wasn't thinking about Dina or the life I'd lost. I was just focused on the next rep, the next step. One night, as I was leaving the gym, I got a notification on my phone. It was from the freelancing platform I'd been using. Another positive review, this one from a high-profile client who promised to recommend me to others. For the first time in months, I felt something close to pride. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was starting to rebuild, piece by piece. The anger didn't disappear overnight, but it started to fade, little by little. I wasn't sure what the future looked like, but for the first time, I felt like it was something I could face. And most importantly, I was starting to remember who I was before Dina's betrayal. Not just Phil, the husband, or Phil, the office worker, but Phil, the guy who could build a life for himself no matter what. A few more months passed, and the days began to blur together. The routine I'd built, editing projects during the day and hitting the gym at night, kept me grounded. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was carving out a version of myself that wasn't defined by Dina or the wreckage of our marriage. The turning point came when I landed my biggest editing project yet. A small production company reached out, saying they'd seen my work online and wanted me to edit a promotional video for one of their upcoming series. It wasn't Hollywood, but it was miles ahead of the birthday videos and local ads I'd been working on. I poured everything into that project. Late nights, early mornings, and every ounce of creative energy I had left in me. When I sent it off, I was equal parts terrified and proud. If they liked it, it would mean validation for all the hard work I'd been doing. If they didn't, well, I wasn't ready to think about that. 2 days later, I got the email. They loved it. The production company even offered me another gig. For the first time since leaving Dina, I felt like I was on solid ground. With the money from that project and a few other smaller ones, I realized I could finally afford to move out of my parents' house. It wasn't that I didn't appreciate their support. I couldn't have made it this far without them, but I knew it was time to start standing on my own again. I found a small apartment downtown, nothing fancy, but it had enough space for a desk and a quiet corner where I could work. Signing that lease felt like reclaiming a piece of myself, a reminder that I could still build a life on my own terms. The first night in the apartment was strange. The silence felt different, not lonely, but peaceful. I set up my desk in front of the window, unpacked my equipment, and sat there for a while, staring out at the city lights. It hit me then how far I'd come. Just a few months ago, I was a broken version of myself, clinging to the scraps of a life that had fallen apart. Now I was rebuilding, not just a home but a sense of purpose. That week, I made a point of getting to know the neighborhood. There was a coffee shop around the corner where I started spending my mornings, sipping coffee and sketching ideas for projects. The barista, a cheerful woman named Claire, always greeted me with a smile and asked about my work. At first, I kept the conversations short, polite but distant. But over time, I found myself opening up. She had an easy way about her, the kind of warmth that didn't ask for anything in return. One morning, as she handed me my usual latte, she asked if I was new to the area. I told her a little about my move and my work, carefully avoiding any mention of Dina. Claire nodded thoughtfully and said, "Sounds like you've been through a lot. But you're here now, and that's what matters." Her words stuck with me. She didn't know the half of it, but somehow she'd hit the nail on the head. I was here now, and that did matter. That night, as I sat at my desk working on another project, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Not just for my career or my independence, but for the life I was slowly starting to build. It wasn't perfect, and there were still nights when the loneliness crept in, but I was learning to live with it. For the first time, I felt like I was more than just the guy who got cheated on. I was Phil, the guy who'd been knocked down but was getting back up, one step at a time. The apartment was beginning to feel like home. It was a modest place, creaky floors, outdated fixtures, but it was mine, and that made all the difference. Over time, I started adding little touches to make it feel personal. A few framed photos of my family on the shelves, a second-hand rug to warm up the living room, and a couple of plants I'd picked up from a local market. I wasn't just rebuilding a physical space. I was reclaiming who I was outside of the marriage, outside of the pain. For the first time in years, I had a sense of autonomy. Every choice, from what I had for dinner to how late I stayed up working, was entirely mine. It was liberating. The editing work continued to flow in, and I was starting to make a name for myself in small creative circles. The production company I'd worked with reached out again, this time for a bigger project, a short documentary they were producing. It was challenging work, with tight deadlines and high expectations, but I poured myself into it. In a strange way, the challenge reminded me of who I used to be. Someone who thrived under pressure, who loved taking on new creative pursuits just to see if I could pull them off. I hadn't felt that spark in years, and rediscovering it was like reconnecting with an old friend. But as much as I was moving forward, there were moments when the past refused to stay buried. One afternoon, I was heading out to grab groceries when my phone buzzed with a new email. It was from Dina. I hesitated before opening it, but curiosity got the better of me. Her message was long, filled with apologies and explanations I hadn't asked for. She said she was sorry for everything, that she missed me, that she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. "I know I can't undo what I did," she wrote, "but I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me someday." Reading her words, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger, of course. How could she expect me to forgive her after everything she'd put me through? But there was also sadness, not for her, but for what we'd lost. I realized then that I didn't hate her. I pitied her. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. That evening, I went to the gym and ran on the treadmill until my legs ached. Pushing myself physically seemed to help quiet the storm in my mind. By the time I left, drenched in sweat and out of breath, I felt lighter, like I'd left a piece of that anger behind. A few weeks later, I ran into Claire, the barista, at the farmer's market. We'd fallen into a friendly routine during my coffee runs, and seeing her outside the shop felt like a happy coincidence. She waved me over, gesturing to a stall selling handmade pottery. "I didn't peg you as a market guy," she teased, holding up a mug shaped like a cat. I shrugged, smiling for what felt like the first time in ages. "Trying something new," I said. We ended up wandering the market together, chatting about everything from work to the best food stalls. There was an ease to our conversation that felt refreshing. No expectations, no ulterior motives, just two people enjoying a Saturday afternoon. When we parted ways, she said, "Take care, Phil. And don't forget, you're not just surviving, you're living now." Her words stuck with me as I walked home, carrying a bag of fresh produce and a small plant I'd impulsively bought for the apartment. That night, I sat at my desk, editing footage for the documentary, and realized she was right. I wasn't just getting through each day anymore. I was starting to live again. It wasn't about forgetting the past or pretending it hadn't happened. It was about learning to carry it without letting it define me. Dina's betrayal had shattered my world, but it hadn't broken me. I was still here, still standing, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was becoming someone I could be proud of. As I settled further into my new life, something unexpected started to happen. I stopped thinking about Dina so much. The pain wasn't gone, it still flared up in quiet moments or when something reminded me of her, but it no longer consumed me. The scars were there, but they weren't bleeding anymore. I started spending more time at the coffee shop where Claire worked, not just because I liked the coffee but because I liked talking to her. She had a way of grounding me, reminding me that life didn't have to be so heavy all the time. She'd crack jokes, tell me about her quirky customers, and somehow make the world feel a little less daunting. One morning, after she handed me my usual latte, she mentioned a local networking event for creatives. "You should check it out," she said. "Might be good for your editing work, and who knows, you might meet someone interesting." I almost brushed it off, but something in her tone made me reconsider. She wasn't pushing, she was encouraging, like she genuinely believed in me. The event was the following week at a trendy co-working space downtown. I showed up feeling out of place. Most of the people there were younger, hipper, and far more confident than I felt. But once I started talking to a few of them, I realized they weren't so different from me. They were just trying to make something of themselves, same as I was. I made a few connections that night. Nothing groundbreaking, but enough to remind me that I wasn't alone in this. One of the people I met even mentioned needing an editor for a passion project they were working on. By the end of the night, I was glad I'd gone. Claire's encouragement to put myself out there stuck with me. It wasn't just about the networking event, it was about embracing the idea that I deserved to be part of something bigger. For so long, I'd felt like I was just scraping by, but now I started to see possibilities where I'd only seen obstacles before. That sense of possibility gave me the courage to do something I'd been avoiding for months. Finalize my divorce. The papers had been sitting in a drawer since shortly after I left Dina. She'd sent them through a lawyer, asking for an uncontested divorce. At the time, I hadn't even been able to look at them without feeling like I was suffocating. But now, it felt like the right time. I dug them out one evening, read through them carefully, and signed my name on the dotted line. It wasn't an act of anger or bitterness, it was an act of closure, a way to finally let go of the life I'd been holding on to. The next day, I dropped the papers off at the lawyer's office and walked out feeling lighter. The divorce didn't erase the hurt or the memories, but it gave me a sense of finality. I wasn't tied to Dina anymore. Not legally, not emotionally. That weekend, I decided to celebrate in my own quiet way. I went to the farmer's market again, this time without any hesitation or a plan. I ended up buying a handmade journal with a leather cover, thinking maybe it was time to start writing things down. Later that night, I sat in my apartment, the journal open in front of me. I didn't know where to start, so I just wrote the first thing that came to mind. I'm still here. It was simple, but it felt right. I wasn't defined by my past anymore. I wasn't just Phil, the guy whose wife cheated on him. I was Phil, the editor, the guy who was figuring it out one step at a time. As I closed the journal and set it on my desk, I felt a sense of calm that I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't perfect, and I still had a long way to go, but for the first time, I felt like I was moving towards something instead of running from it. I was free. With the divorce finalized, I started to notice a change in myself. Not something dramatic or sudden, but a quiet shift that felt like a step forward. The weight I'd been carrying for months didn't feel as heavy anymore. It was still there, lingering like an old bruise, but it no longer defined every moment of my day. I poured more energy into my work, picking up bigger editing projects and exploring new creative challenges. One of my regular clients, the production company, invited me to collaborate on a full-length documentary. A chance to move beyond small gigs and into something more substantial. The project was about local artists and their journeys, showcasing how creativity could thrive even in the toughest circumstances. It felt personal in a way I hadn't expected, like their stories mirrored my own struggle to rebuild after everything fell apart. I threw myself into the work, spending long nights perfecting every detail. The process was exhausting but fulfilling, and by the time we wrapped up, I felt a sense of accomplishment I hadn't felt in years. When the documentary premiered at a small local festival, seeing my name in the credits was surreal. It reminded me that I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving, in my own way. Outside of work, life was becoming richer, too. My casual chats with Claire at the coffee shop turned into longer conversations, and we started meeting up outside her shifts. Nothing serious, just friendly walks around the neighborhood or grabbing lunch at one of the market stalls she loved. One afternoon, as we sat by the river eating sandwiches, Claire asked about my editing work. I told her about the documentary and how it felt like the biggest thing I'd ever worked on. She smiled and said, "You're building something amazing, Phil. Don't forget to give yourself credit for that." Her words stayed with me. I wasn't used to hearing praise, especially not from someone who seemed to genuinely mean it. For a while, I worried that I was reading too much into our growing friendship. I liked Claire, a lot, but I didn't know if I was ready to take that step. I wasn't sure if she felt the same, and part of me was scared of getting hurt again. Then, one evening, I found myself back at the coffee shop, watching Claire joke with a customer as she worked behind the counter. Her laugh was bright, unguarded, and it hit me how different she was from Dina. Dina's charm had always been calculated, like she was performing for an audience. Claire's was effortless, as if she didn't care who was watching. When she noticed me sitting there, she waved and came over during a lull in her shift. "You look like you've got something on your mind," she said, sliding into the seat across from me. I hesitated, then decided to be honest. "I guess I've been thinking about how much has changed in the past year." She nodded, her expression soft. Change can be scary, but it can also be good. Sometimes you just have to trust that where you're going is better than where you've been. Her words hit home, and for the first time, I felt like I was ready to let someone in again. That night, as I walked home, I thought about everything I'd been through. The heartbreak, the anger, the rebuilding. And for the first time, I felt like I wasn't looking back anymore. I wasn't just moving on from Dina. I was moving towards something new, something that felt hopeful. Whether it was with Claire or just with myself, I didn't know yet. But for the first time in a long time, I was okay with not knowing. For the first time, I felt like I was living in the present, and that was enough. Happiness didn't come all at once. It wasn't some grand, transformative moment that turned my life around. It crept in slowly, like sunlight filtering through a window in the morning, soft and almost unnoticeable at first. But one day, I woke up and realized that the heaviness I'd been carrying for so long wasn't there anymore. My days had started to feel full. Not just busy, but meaningful. The documentary I'd worked on opened doors to new opportunities, and suddenly I was editing projects for clients I'd only dreamed of working with. I even got an inquiry from a national nonprofit looking for someone to craft a series of videos for their upcoming campaign. Work gave me a sense of purpose, but it wasn't the only thing. I'd fallen into a rhythm with Claire, spending more and more time together. What started as casual meetups turned into real companionship. She had a way of bringing out the best in me, encouraging me to see the good in life even when I was stuck in my own head. One evening, after we'd spent the day wandering through an art exhibit downtown, Claire asked if I ever thought about the future. It caught me off guard. For so long, I'd been focused on just getting through the day, rebuilding piece by piece. But as I thought about her question, I realized that, for the first time in years, I was starting to picture a future for myself. One that wasn't defined by my past or by Dina. I think about it more now, I admitted. I guess I'm starting to believe it can be good. Claire smiled, and her hand brushed mine as we walked. It can be, she said. You just have to let yourself believe you deserve it. That night, I sat in my apartment, thinking about what happiness really meant. It wasn't about erasing the past or pretending it hadn't happened. It was about learning to live with it, to carry the lessons forward without letting the pain define me. I started to notice the little things that brought me joy, the satisfaction of finishing a project, the warmth of Claire's laugh, the way sunlight poured through the window onto my desk in the morning. One day, while working on a particularly complex editing project, I caught myself smiling, really smiling, for no reason at all. It wasn't forced or fleeting, it was just there, bubbling up from somewhere deep inside. I realized then that happiness wasn't something I had to chase or fight for. It was something I could create for myself, moment by moment, choice by choice. I began to take more time for the things that mattered. I visited my parents regularly, thanking them for the support they'd given me when I was at my lowest. I reconnected with old friends, people I'd lost touch with during my marriage. Slowly, I started to rebuild not just my life, but my relationships. And then there was Claire. We weren't rushing into anything, and that felt right. But being with her was easy in a way I hadn't thought possible. She didn't try to fill the gaps left by Dina, she didn't have to. She just made me want to be a better version of myself. One evening, as we sat on my apartment balcony watching the city lights, she asked, "Do you feel happy?" I thought about it for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah," I said. "I think I do." For the first time in a long time, I wasn't looking over my shoulder at the life I'd lost. I wasn't carrying the weight of what Dina had done or the person I used to be. I was here in the present, and for the first time it felt enough. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living, truly living.